This woman's home had just been attacked by Native Americans. Fortunately, no one was hurt, and they only took some belongings before leaving, but Kristina was so frightened that her due date was brought forward. At that moment, her husband rushed back in great urgency. Kristina asked him to go and find their friend Ulrika for help, but in this desolate place, the town was still 30 kilometers away. Could Kristina rely on her willpower to hold on until the end? Even in such a dire situation, as a mother, Kristina still tried to keep her children calm, but as time passed, half a day went by and her husband had still not returned with help. The pain in Kristina's abdomen became unbearable, and the liquid on the ground clearly showed that her water had broken. At this critical moment, the helpless woman could only rely on herself. Before she could even prepare, the baby slipped out, and Kristina fainted. All the memories of her past life in Sweden flashed through her mind. They had come to America to escape poverty, and after enduring so much suffering, she could not accept dying like this. Meanwhile, her husband finally arrived with Ulrika. At Ulrika's urgent insistence, Carl quickly prepared everything to assist. By around midnight, both mother and child were finally stable, but as Kristina looked at her newborn baby, she was still shaken with fear. It was all thanks to Ulrika, who had come from far away to help. The next morning, it was time for Ulrika to leave. Kristina and her husband wanted her to stay a few more days, but Ulrika declined, worried that her daughter would be concerned. For two women in a foreign land, such deep connection was rare, and no one knew if they would meet again. As time passed, winter was approaching. Carl made preparations to strengthen the cabin against the cold wind, but they had never experienced a Minnesota winter, which seemed even harsher than back in Sweden. The couple shivered inside the cabin. Carl felt constant guilt, as he had not fulfilled the promises he once made. Since Kristina chose to follow him, no matter how much hardship they endured, she held on to her resolve never to turn back. At last, winter passed and spring arrived, and they managed to survive the ordeal. But while Kristina was caring for the children, her eldest daughter suddenly told her in panic that she saw figures not far away. Kristina immediately sensed danger, fearing another encounter with Native Americans. After calling for her husband without response, she quickly hid the children in a corner, grabbed a hunting rifle, loaded it, and prepared to defend against an attack. With trembling fear, she stepped outside. In the end, it was a false alarm. The visitors were the pastor and his wife whom they had met on the Immigrant ship. Unable to tolerate the dominance of the local church faction, they had asked around and finally found where Kristina and her husband were living. They had come to settle here as well and continue providing spiritual guidance for Swedish believers. But for Kristina, this brought pain rather than comfort. She had endured the death of her daughter Anna, the hardships of the sea voyage, poverty, and isolation. She had once prayed with devotion, but now she was filled with doubt toward God. The arrival of the pastor and Judith forced her to confront the question once again. Could faith still save her, or was it just another burden that deepened human suffering? As time passed, more and more Swedish immigrants gathered in this land. This was due to the influence of the pastor and his wife, who even established a religious community based on faith, bringing the spiritual order of the old world into the new one. But such beliefs might no longer be suitable, because the new world required a new kind of faith, one rooted in humanity and compassion rather than punishment and shame. Yet the pastor remained stubborn, even declaring that he would build a church, a school, and shops here. Carl, who believed in a new order, began to question this vision.
Vem ska betala för allt det? Vem ska bygga den här kyrkan?
Life seemed to be stabilizing on the surface, but in reality, a greater crisis was quietly forming. One day, in an effort to win people over, the pastor's wife specially made a hat for Kristina, a symbol of devout faith and religious identity. But as they were talking, the sound of horses outside immediately caught Kristina's attention. To her great surprise, it was her closest and most sincere friend, Ulrika. After more than a year apart, the two women embraced with joy. But when the pastor's wife saw this, her expression turned cold. Being from the same homeland, she knew Ulrika's past and believed it tainted their religious values. Even though Kristina explained that Ulrika had left that life behind and was now her close friend, the pastor's wife still insisted that such a woman did not deserve redemption. She even warned Kristina to stay away from her, fearing her soul would be dragged into corruption. Kristina then invited her friend inside. Ulrika was full of excitement, as she was about to marry a local pastor. He was the same man who had once given them food and help when they first arrived in Minnesota. She invited Kristina to attend the wedding with her husband and children in the coming days, but Kristina hesitated.
Är det prästkärringen du är rädd för?
Nej,
Är det för hennes skull på den där hemska svarta hätten?
han är baptist, Ulrika. Olausson, de har tänkt att sätta Karl-Oskar i kyrkorådet.
Du skäms för mig.
Det är klart att jag inte skäms för dig.
Efter allt vi har varit med om tillsammans så sitter du här och ljuger mig rätt upp i ansiktet.
Måtte Gud förlåta dig.
Jag behöver inte dina jävla böner.
At this moment, her heart was torn apart. She respected Ulrika, yet she was still bound by the shame and moral constraints of her old faith. She had been taught since childhood that such a past was sinful and that those considered impure were not worthy of entering a church. Although she had learned to feel compassion, fully accepting it remained a difficult barrier, so her refusal was not born of arrogance, but because she was not yet ready to openly defy the moral beliefs deeply ingrained within her. She feared judgment and the sense of betraying her doctrine. Perhaps her absence was a way to avoid wrongdoing, but in Ulrika's eyes, it felt like rejection and denial. This refusal drove a wedge between them. Ulrika felt deeply hurt, realizing that no matter how hard she tried to change, society and even her friends still refused to see her as an equal. Yet Kristina suffered even more, because she was not only rejecting Ulrika, but also the woman who had once helped her find her child and restored her faith in humanity. She knew she had hurt Ulrika and betrayed the kindness within herself. At that moment, both women lost, one to wounded pride and the other to fear. Year after year, day after day, the family had now lived on this land for 3 years. What was once a lonely cabin had gradually grown into a small Swedish community in America. With more immigrants settling here, the pastor then proposed that the boys should attend school, while girls were excluded. This was the same system practiced in Sweden, where women were expected to remain silent and focus on family duties, but Karl firmly rejected the idea. His youngest daughter was born here, so why should she be bound by outdated and unfair traditions? This marks the end of the 4th chapter of The Immigrants. The 4th chapter opens with Kristina's childbirth in the wilderness, revealing the deeper layers of the immigrant epic. It is not only a struggle for survival, but also a fierce collision between old beliefs and a new land. As Kristina brings new life into the world through pain and hardship, she is also breaking free from dependence on divine salvation and beginning to question it. The religious order brought by the pastor and his wife reveals submission and hypocrisy under harsh conditions. The film's sharpest moment lies in Kristina's refusal to attend Ulrika's wedding. In that instant, moral constraints suffocate human warmth, exposing how immigrants rebuilding their lives are still imprisoned by the shame of the old world. Kristina's awakening is a slow and painful process, from standing strong with a rifle to protect her family to insisting on her daughter's right to education. She is searching for a new kind of faith built on empathy and courage. What the new world truly needs is not transplanted churches, but a spiritual strength that grows from human nature itself. Why should people who have already left their homelands still be bound by its rules? The pastor proposed that all boys should attend school, while girls were not allowed.
Du sätter emot Guds vilja, Karl-Oskar Nilsson.
Guds eller prästens?
Jag utsätts till präst i Guds anda. Ifrågasätter du det?
An awkward silence fell over the scene. Karl controlled his emotions, unwilling to completely break with the pastor. However, he still insisted that all his children must receive an education. Such distorted beliefs would only confine the mind and go against human nature, and they did not belong on a land that claimed freedom and equality. On the way home, Karl decided to send the children to a regular school, although his wife said nothing on the surface. As a devout believer, she felt deeply conflicted. That night, the couple experienced their first true conflict. Kristina wanted her husband to write a letter to Ulrika, expressing her apology for what had happened a few days earlier, but when her husband asked her to dictate the message, she instead spoke words filled with complaint. This was the conflict between faith and reality. Her husband was a pragmatist, while Kristina had been shaped by religious doctrine since childhood. Even though she had once questioned God in the face of suffering, she still could not let go of her spiritual dependence. What was even more alarming was that her emotional outburst caused blood to flow down her legs. It was clear that the child in her womb could not be saved this time. Life continued with bitterness. The woman had just undergone a painful operation, performed by a doctor Ulrika had brought from town. The doctor warned them that these immigrant families could not continue having children without limit. He also asked Ulrika to pass along a message. The implication was clear. If Kristina became pregnant again, her fragile body might not survive it. At the same time, It hinted that Ulrika had seen the burden placed on Kristina by her faith and the role forced upon her as a woman. This made Kristina begin to truly question whether God had ever cared for her, and whether this so-called new life was simply another form of suffering. This incident completely shattered her faith and left her physically and emotionally drained. In the days that followed, Kristina's emotions became increasingly unstable. When she heard her husband teaching their daughter English, she noticed he used the name Nils. Who was Nils? It turned out that Carl had changed his name to Nils in order to better integrate into the new society and gain acceptance. When their youngest daughter stepped down from her seat, Kristina tried to call her over, but the child turned and went to her father instead. This small detail revealed how Kristina's rigid beliefs were beginning to damage her relationship with her family. Deep down, she was aware of it, yet she remained trapped in her inner struggle. At that moment, a deer ran into the yard and began eating the vegetables she had planted. This was not the first time it had come. The apple tree she brought from Sweden had already been ruined by it. Without hesitation, Kristina picked up a hunting rifle and intended to end the animal's life, but instead fired a shot into the air. Her husband came out of the house. At this point, even the smallest incidents could ignite her emotions. Faith can save a person, but it can also push them into despair. Kristina was trapped within her own turmoil. A few days later, it was time for the children to go to school, and Carl had prepared the wagon early in the morning, but Kristina remained unhappy, insisting that girls should not attend school, as it went against religious tradition. To ease his wife's distress, Carl reluctantly decided to keep their daughter at home.
Marta, du får stanna hemma hos mor.
Men jag ska med till skolan.
Nej,
Jag ska med.
jag har ändrat mig.
Jag ska med till skolan.
Du gör det som jag säger.
Jag ska dit.
Du gör det som jag säger!
Although the girl longed to go to school, she had no choice but to accept her father's decision. She could only watch her siblings leave, staying behind unwillingly with her mother.
Det är för ditt eget bästa.
Vet du vad som är bäst för mig? Har du frågat mig? Du är bara avundsjuk. Det är bara för att du inte kan skriva själv.
Nu gör du som jag säger!
Jag hatar dig!
This was the first time Kristina hurt someone, pushing her daughter's resentment even deeper. The girl ran into the nearby forest in sorrow. By evening, her daughter Marta had still not returned home. Kristina grew terrified, fearing how she would face her husband if something happened. Carrying a rifle and holding her younger child, she rushed to the pastor's house, begging him to gather people to search for her daughter. But the pastor's wife told her that he was in a meeting and could not be disturbed. It was hard to believe such words came from someone so devout. Refusing to help was one thing, but the cold and distant attitude made it worse. This was the faith Kristina had once relied on. One could only hope she would awaken and no longer be blinded by false kindness, to see clearly that this so-called faith was nothing more than a chain wrapped around human nature, not a true path to salvation. Fortunately, after searching the forest for a long time, Kristina finally found her daughter trapped in a difficult situation. The condition was not good, as the girl had tripped over a wooden stake and severely injured her ankle. Kristina had no choice but to carry her, trying to find a way out of the dark forest, but they had underestimated the wilderness, and before long, mother and daughter lost their way. In the distance, however, a faint red glow appeared. This marks the end of the 5th chapter of The Immigrants. The 5th chapter focuses on the cultural fracture and crisis of faith within the immigrant family. Carl embraces the new world and insists that all children deserve equal education. Kristina, however, remains bound by traditional doctrine, viewing change as betrayal. Their conflict erupts fully through issues of education and identity. After losing her child, Kristina's faith collapses completely, and her behavior grows increasingly extreme. The imagery of the rifle, the forest, and the wilderness reflects her inner struggle and spiritual turmoil. Her old beliefs fail to offer salvation and instead become heavy chains that oppress both her family and herself. The pain of migration is a brutal journey of the soul. Torn between the old and the new world, a woman lost in her faith stubbornly followed doctrine and refused to let her daughter attend school, which planted resentment in the child's heart. After being struck hard by Kristina, the girl ran into the deep forest alone, filled with grievance and sorrow. Even as night fell, she still had not returned home. Kristina was consumed by fear, terrified that something terrible had happened. Fortunately, she found her daughter deep in the forest with a severely sprained ankle, but just as they tried to find their way back, they became completely lost. In their despair, a faint flicker of firelight appeared ahead, like a fragile hope. But what made it frightening was that the fire came from a Native American settlement. Kristina had encountered Native Americans before and had long been influenced by stories portraying them as dangerous. Yet now, trapped in the wilderness with no way out. She had no choice but to let go of her prejudice and seek help. They could not understand each other's language, but the Native American woman before her showed kindness. When Kristina revealed her daughter's injured leg, the woman seemed to understand their plight. She even removed her own cloak and gently covered the injured girl. All of this showed that Native Americans were not as cruel as people claimed. Their sincere eyes and compassionate actions made Kristina realize that those labeled as uncivilized could be far more gentle than the so-called civilized world. What you fear may be more humane than what you trust. This is a powerful irony and a reflection of deeper historical truths. It redefined Kristina's faith. Redemption did not come from God, but from real people and the world around her. This realization pushed her toward awakening and letting go of blind belief. Guided by the Native Americans, she and her daughter safely found their way out of the forest. Meanwhile, neighbors nearby had been searching anxiously. When Carl finally saw his wife and daughter, the three of them embraced tightly, asking what had happened. But at that moment, the cloak on the girl drew suspicion from the pastor's wife.
Vad är det hon har på sig?
Fick hjälp av indianerna.
Herregud, ta bort den.
Det var en gåva.
Kom, jag ska
Hon behåller
hjälpa
den om hon vill.
dig. Jag ska hjälpa dig.
Men hör du inte vad jag säger, Judith? Märta bestämmer själv.
Because of a single piece of clothing, she felt that faith had been violated, which was difficult to comprehend. The villagers even shifted the blame onto Ulrika. Ulrika, Kristina's friend, had once survived through difficult means, but she had long since changed her life. This time, Kristina no longer remained silent and chose to defend her friend in front of the crowd. This became one of the most powerful moments of her journey in America. She finally broke free from the constraints of religion and the chains of the old world. In that moment, she truly became an immigrant. After returning home, Kristina began to dress herself carefully. Because of her previous emotional struggles, she had often clashed with her husband and felt unworthy of being a good wife. So she wanted to change everything that day. Despite knowing her fragile condition, she still made a determined choice. It was not simply about repairing her relationship with her husband, but about saying goodbye to her past pain. After enduring suffering, loneliness, loss, and the collapse of her faith, she made the most free, courageous, and dangerous decision of her life. Through intimacy, she reaffirmed that she was still alive, still capable of love, and still able to choose her own fate. This was not a farewell to the past, but the first time she truly chose how to live. 2 days later, Kristina personally traveled to a nearby town in Minnesota. She wanted to visit her closest friend and sincerely apologized to Ulrika for the misunderstanding, hoping to mend their broken bond.
Du är det bästa som har hänt mig i det här landet. Jag förtjänar ingenting. Vill jag be dig om det? Jag saknar dig. Kanske behöver du mig också. Förlåt, det var inte meningen att störa.
Jaså?
Faced with such heartfelt sincerity, Ulrika could not refuse forgiveness. Both women smiled again after so long and walked into Ulrika's elegant home. Everything she had built came from her kindness and sincerity. Life seemed to return to stability. The rift between Kristina and her daughter was healed, and she became pregnant once more. Although their neighbors continued to judge them with suspicion, Kristina had already broken free from those constraints and chose to live for herself and her family. But fate remained unpredictable. Not long after, while working in the barn, Kristina suddenly felt intense pain in her abdomen, and blood once again flowed down her legs. This was a sign that her life was nearing its end. Even though Ulrika brought a doctor from town, nothing could be done. All they could do now was hope for a miracle. But miracles are rare. Kristina's life quietly faded away in the wilderness. At that very moment, the apple tree they had brought from their homeland bore fruit. She could not continue her lineage in the New World, but she used her life to plant roots in this land. Where life ends, hope begins. This marks the conclusion of The Immigrants. The Immigrants is adapted from the novel series by Swedish author Vilhelm Moberg. It is an epic of survival woven with pain and resilience, revealing the harsh paradox behind migration. The poverty and constraints of the old world suffocate, while the promise of freedom in the new world is shadowed by danger. Kristina's transformation is the soul of the story. From a simple farm woman to someone shattered by loss and disillusionment, she ultimately achieves a spiritual awakening in the American wilderness. Her journey from conflict to reconciliation with Ulrika reflects the breaking of class prejudice. The kindness shown by Native Americans challenges the traditional narrative of civilization versus savagery. The apple tree carried across the ocean becomes a poetic symbol throughout the story. Immigrants can only take root in new land through sacrifice. Kristina's death during childbirth becomes the story's most tragic note. Old lives often become the foundation for new beginnings. The story goes beyond a simple tale of migration and calmly examines the struggle of individuals within the tide of history, revealing humanity's eternal pursuit of hope. True migration is a fracture of the soul, followed by rebirth.